they are all saying that this person is transgender. Why is the RCMP not speaking to this? Why are we hiding this from the public?
Well, first off, thank you for your question. We're not hiding it. In fact, you're the first media to ask the question. I will say this. We identified the suspect as they chose to be identified in public and in social media. I can say that Jesse was born as a biological male who approximately, the information that I have, approximately 6 years ago began to transition to female and identified as female both socially and publicly.
So let's shift our attention up north for a second, because this week the country of Canada was rocked by a massive school shooting. This apparently took place at the Tumbler Ridge Secondary School in British Columbia, and thus far we know that at least 10 people are confirmed dead, 25 or more are injured. It's a terrible situation, huge mass casualty event, and my prayers are with all involved. But that said, we're already watching a concerted effort by the Canadian government to cover up the truth of what really happened here. And in order to break that down, I think we should start from the beginning and note that this is the exact type of tragedy that we have been extensively told in America. Well, if we just reformed our gun laws, this would not happen, right? If we were just like our friends up north, magically, evil people would go away. And of course, that has never been the reality. The truth is that evil exists in this world, mental illness exists in this world, and no attempt to legislate in a way that hides from it or pretends it doesn't exist will just magically make it disappear. And you can even try to make attempts to regulate these things, but at the end of the day, people will always slip through the cracks, and that has, of course, always been the conservative case for the Second Amendment. Hey, what happens when police fails? What happens when law enforcement fails or the system fails? And, it's just you in a dangerous situation and you have no means of defense. But even as it pertains, I would argue, to schools, this is the secondary point that a lot of people miss about the school shooting debate. Sure, there's a lot to be said about the Second Amendment. But a point I've been making since I was in high school and I watched Parkland happen is that every school, in not just the United States, in every Western country, knowing that this is a thing that happens, unfortunately and sadly, every single school should be protected by either armed police or armed security. And I extensively remember hearing liberals always counter that, oh, but it's so scary to have kids go to school where there's armed guards or security. And it's like, okay, they see the police in many other contexts in their life. But of course, secondly, yeah, I agree it's not ideal. But at the end of the day, do you want the kids protected or not? I always found it very ironic how, they're crazy about the demand to ban guns, and if we got rid of AR-15s, this wouldn't happen or something. Yet the most concrete, obvious solution is what? You have to stop making schools such soft targets, and the moment that they always say they don't want to do that, or it's bad, or it's hurtful, or whatever, always really reveals the truth of their stance, which is they don't care about these school shootings. They're always excuses to politicize, excuses to push gun control, and, that's just the simple reality on this. By the way, if you want to say, oh, it's too expensive. Okay, you know what? Our children are the most important thing on our society. They're the future. They're innocent. I'm willing to literally pay more in taxes. And Canadians already pay a bunch of taxes, okay? But I think we're all collectively willing to pay a bunch of money in taxes if it actually means that money will go somewhere, such as protecting children when they go to school. That's a just cause for me. Yes, me, the small government conservative, I will go and say, raise my taxes so that way we can fund it. And I think everybody agrees with this. So just point number one I'd like to make before they try to, gun control. And by the way, I'm sure that Mark Carney's liberal government's going to attempt to blame this on the guns. But folks, the story doesn't actually stop there. I'm just getting started on this. Because there's a secondary detail, and as you might be able to imagine, given the recent track record on these kinds of things, and that is, of course, the gender identity of the school shooter. When we talk about the fact that people who are not right upstairs often perpetrate these kinds of events and combine that fact with the hormones and the things that, they're taking that alter their mental state, it's a completely valid point. This clearly seems to be a rising epidemic in Western countries. And yet, interestingly, you'll watch today as the Canadian government and local police try to shift from that. Of course, as usual, in every recent case of school shootings perpetrated by a person of trans affiliation, you always see this try to get buried, or let's ignore this detail of the story, when in reality, no, this detail is extremely important. So We'll get into all of it, guys, but first, basic details on the shooting. Take a listen.
Begin with breaking news out of Tumbler Ridge, where a lockdown is in place at a pair of schools due to an active shooter incident. Tumbler Ridge RCMP is urging people to stay inside, lock their doors, and shelter in place. Police were on scene at Tumbler Ridge Secondary about 1:20 this afternoon, responding to an active shooter. Police now say the original suspect has been located deceased, and they're now working to determine whether a second suspect was involved and what the total number of victims may be. The initial suspect was described as a female with brown hair wearing a dress.
Yeah, well, you may have caught the detail at the end there about the suspect allegedly being a woman with brown hair wearing a dress while she perpetrated it. Turns out there's a little more to the story than that. As a matter of fact, the suspect has since been identified as an 18-year-old. This headline is wrong, but an 18-year-old by the name of Jesse Strang. And yes, this individual is a transgender. He was born a man. He now identifies, quote unquote, as a woman. And that is, of course, the story. Yet, as quite expectedly, when you try to Google, for example, the identity of the British Columbia shooting suspect, you don't really seem to get that detail from much of the mainstream media. As a matter of fact, New York Times, as one example, more interested in preserving the school shooter's gender identity than simply telling the truth. You can see here, the 18-year-old fatally shot her mother and stepbrother, as well as 6 people at a school, before killing herself ultimately in the school shooting. And it's like, seriously, right? This is what we're doing right now. But of course, I would argue there's a reason why you always, and it's not just this case, right? You always see such a concerted effort by mainstream media to cover up trans violence that does occur. Because I think, frankly, when you actually look back at many of them, think about this for a moment, right? Just mentally. Think about the recent school shootings that we've seen in the United States and try to remember the details there, right? I think Covenant comes to mind. Uvalde comes to mind. There was a recent one this past school year in Minnesota. And you begin to notice over the past couple of years, there does seem to be this growing epidemic of school shooters who were of trans identity, right? People try to argue, oh, it's not happening. Or they might say, well, what about per capita? What about people who committed school shootings that were not trans? To which I say, fair point. I'm not saying trans people are the only ones who are committing school shootings as of late. But it is interesting that we're talking about something that wasn't really happening before. This was really a rare sight until recently. And then secondly, trans individuals identify as only about 1% of the US population. I would guess that the number in Canada there is very similar. And yet of recent school shootings in the United States and now Canada, there does seem to be a disproportionate number of them as of late who are identifying as trans. Let's also not forget one of the most famous cases of violence in the past year, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, perpetrated by a man who was not appearing to be trans himself, but also was dating a trans, right? So it does seem to be that there is a growing trend of this happening. The media doesn't really want to talk about it, which is, of course, why, you kind of just see this intentional ambiguity whenever they write these headlines about identifying the shooter. And who knows, I think the reason for that, frankly, is very obvious.
It helps nobody to hide behind obfuscations and in clarity. It's right that people know the truth about this, and not to hide.
And it does matter. People will be very specific about, someone arriving at a school at 10:24 or be very specific about these things. Well, we need to be specific about who commits the crime. And we've had this issue. Scotland has gone completely mad on it, but mainstream media in this country and in America and in Canada has really, really gone woke crazy on this stuff. Will routinely, newspapers here and online here will routinely report things which are factually untrue. They will report that a boy has died or a girl has died when actually it is the opposite sex because they don't want to misgender. And not correct it. And some of the time I'm actually going, I actually don't know who this person is, and yet this is one of the most key facts. We know people's names and we know their sex. That's kind of like the key, and their age. Those are kind of the key facts about people because they are the most relevant facts. But
yeah, and really, I don't think this is a complicated issue to understand. I'd further point out there are current alleged reports, but of this individual also being on Reddit as soon as 15 years old, where he's talking about how, he wants to take HRT soon. And then clearly something was going on in his brain where he kept identifying himself as an anime character. And there was a LARP going on where, this, by the way, is very common with radical leftists, especially those on Reddit, where they believe they have some type of affiliation with a cartoon character or superhero, something very childlike, but then they take those weird twisted fantasies into the real world. And that's how you, by the way, get the epidemic of left-wing violence. I don't know if you've noticed, a lot of these people, not just this person, but a lot of them seem to believe there's some type of characters in a movie or video game. When I use the term overgrown children, please understand, I'm not just talking about maybe some mental immaturity or, crying too much the way they act. It's also, it translates to this, right? A lot of these people, the real thing, actually see themselves as they get their morality, first of all, from a cartoon or a superhero movie, something very childish that they don't actually understand. And then they take that into the real world and use it as some, just cause for violence or something like that. And if you're not familiar, you can learn more about this. Just go on Reddit, honestly, for 2 seconds. You'll see this very prominently displayed. But, regardless of how substantiated these reports are, I'm just going to, put that out there. This has been reported. I think of what we do know and what is confirmed is absolutely undeniable here, which is that first and foremost, you're talking about a mentally ill person. Right? All school shooters are mentally ill. You have to have mental illness severe mental illness, I should say, to want to go and commit something like that. But of course, the argument long posed by people on our side about the issue of HRT, gender transition, right? And the correlation that it has as of late to school shootings is the very fact that when you're taking people who probably already have issues going on upstairs, right? They believe they're born in the wrong body and all of this. And then secondly, okay, instead of responding to that by saying, hey, maybe there's something going on here, maybe we should treat you, society, of course, responds by instead celebrating, uplifting that, and then treating with the supposed gender-affirming care, which is what? Not just a bunch of body-altering hormones, but also on top of that, right? Brain-altering hormones, actively changing your mental state, which already to begin with, in a lot of these individuals, very likely was disturbed. And so, as we point out with the mental illness issue as it pertains to school shootings, yes, there's absolutely something to be said about the fact that when you have people who already likely are unstable, and instead of treating their instability, you double down on that by giving them hormones that make them even more unstable, then it perhaps really is not that hard to explain why you're seeing the growing and rising epidemic of violence being perpetrated by members of this so-called community, right? It's simply the truth, okay? And that ought to be something we should have a conversation about. The reality is they don't want to have that conversation for a couple different reasons. Because number one, it's actually quite common sense when you think about it, right? Anyone who's being honest with themselves will say, hey, that's actually kind of logical, right? Isn't that going to really mess up your brain? But then secondly, I would even argue perhaps there's a pharmaceutical or financial interest behind it, right? Not just the political interests of trying to quote unquote, stand with the trans community or whatever. But of course, secondly, the fact that pharmaceutical companies make millions of dollars selling these drugs, selling these treatment to people. Frankly, they probably don't care what it does. And then through the guise of, the social stigma, we don't want to seem transphobic. I think the simple reality is a lot of this stuff doesn't even get properly studied, right? What are the effects? Because I remember hearing for years, leftists would come and say, hey, look, according to the studies, according to research, puberty blockers and HRT and all of these things, they don't actually have a permanent effect on the body or puberty or anything, which was often used as a justification to keep transing the kids, essentially, right? To which I say, that is obviously not true, right? It defies basic common sense. Yes, if you put in unnatural hormones that block the process of puberty, that is going to have a permanent effect on your body, even if you get off of it. Okay, so you're going to start going into puberty at what, 19, 20 years old? Yes, obviously there's going to be physiological differences, right? But of course, while hiding behind the guise of science, what's the reality? Is that if pharmaceutical companies had to have an honest conversation and had to research this type of stuff properly, it's very likely that, frankly, given what we're noticing in the real world, you would kind of reach the findings that, hey, maybe this stuff is not entirely safe. Maybe it's not properly understood. Maybe the effects of it can be a lot more severe than we think, and quote unquote gender affirming care can actually have negative consequences. So, of course, if that happened, then we probably lose a lot of money, right? If we were honest about this. So instead, let's sort of use the guise of politics and being tolerant and all this stuff to keep on saying, oh, how dare you block gender affirming care? Don't be hateful. Don't be transphobic. No. We're being very loving, actually. We're asking crooked pharmaceutical companies to be honest about the effects of their drugs. And I'd argue for all of those reasons combined, both the politics and both the financial interests, that part probably doesn't get talked about enough. That's why you never get honesty on this subject. And it goes one level deeper, right? A question I've often posed in a lot of school and mass shootings is, how many of these people in general were on brain-altering hormones in some way, shape, or form, right? The trans thing has happened a lot in recent years, but I also beg a question like SSRIs, right? Antidepressants, things like that. Further, there have been documented active shootings, school shootings that have happened, taken on those too, right? I genuinely would like to see a real scientific, not a political one, not a paid one, a real scientific study, while they try to push gun control and all of these things, of how many mass shooters in the past 20 to 25 years have been on some type of brain-altering hormone that's made by pharmaceutical companies, right? Just a question I'd like to beg. But of course, if we had that conversation, then very likely, again, the pharmaceutical companies who are selling those drugs wouldn't want to do it. See? Because they're making a lot of money off of this. And so you combine all of that. You combine the fact, by the way, that, despite claiming to be counter-revolutionary, the left wing and liberal media and all of the institutions in our country, or revolutionary, I should say, not counter-revolutionary, but, all the leftists in this country love to shill for big pharma. They love to shill for big medicine, the big institutions. That's kind of all confounds on itself to why you can never get an honest answer on that, right? And it's just very simple, You're giving guns to people who are putting a bunch of crazy mind-altering hormones in their body and then claim that surely, there's no way this could possibly correlate to the school shootings they're committing. That's ridiculous. Of course it is. And that, of course, brings us to this recent press conference with Canadian authorities, specifically this police commander here, who gets asked about this because it's a growing question. And, the information is getting out there. Hey, this shooter was of transgender identity, and take a listen to what happens next, as you could imagine.
We've heard all around the world reports coming out from different media, not local, but world. And we've heard people from Tumbler Ridge, actually people that know the shooter, and they are all saying that this person is transgender. Why is the RCMP not speaking to this? Why are we hiding this from the public?
Well, first off, thank you for your question. We're not hiding it. In fact, you're the first media to ask the question. I will say this. We identified the suspect as they chose to be identified in public and in social media. I can say that Jesse was born as a biological male who approximately, the information that I have, approximately 6 years ago began to transition to female and identified as female both socially and publicly.
Unfortunately, we've heard a lot of transgender as mass shootings. Do you think there's a correlation here?
It's too early to say whether that has any correlation in this investigation. I think it's important to recognize that this investigation is still in its infancy. We have scenes still lock down the school and the residents while we execute search warrants and gather further evidence and talk to witnesses that may have further evidence for police.
So, as was pointed out in the previous clip, you typically expect that when the police or the media are identifying a suspect in a crime, very basic things, the first couple things you point out are their name, their age, and their gender. And yet, knowingly, this has been obfuscated or hidden by the Canadian police. And then you even get the admission there, right? The freaking school shooter, the person that just killed 9 people. The Canadian police are more concerned with protecting that individual's preferred pronouns and gender identity and how he chose to identify himself rather than telling the actual truth. Only now when you're confronted on it do you point out, yes, the suspect was indeed a biological male. Are those not basic facts of the case, right? When they do the autopsy here, are they going to write down, female? Or are they going to write down male? When they study body composition, bone structure, look at injury, superficial wounds, all those things, right? Are they going to be studying a female or a male? right? In the context of crime, which is it, right? Is it how they socially identify themselves, or it is simply the biological reality of who they are? But of course, just what a ridiculous display, to say the least. You know, you have a school shooter, and you're more concerned with that person's preferred pronouns than telling the truth. Keep in mind, this is the police. Their job is to inform the public, and they're disinforming the public. They're hiding that fact, right? And then only when you ask about it on like the second day are they saying, well, you know, yeah, I guess you're right. They were born as a biological male. And by the way, this is the first reporter to ask it. In that case, what is the rest of the Canadian media doing, right? They write all these reports about like, the full details of the shooting, right? Highly detailed. Goes on and on. Here's what time it happened. Here's where it happened. Here's how many people are dead. Here are the victims. Yet you can't even properly identify the shooter themselves for this particular reason. Why? Well, you know the answer why, right? And it would help if we would just be honest about this. Who knows? Maybe we could actually prevent these types of events going forward if we had a real transparent conversation about the medical and mental health reality of this situation. But of course, that's not going to happen. Instead, you're immediately just going to hear more calls to take away the rights of ordinary citizens because of, people who are screwed up in the head and taking potentially hormones and drugs that they actually shouldn't biologically, physiologically be on, especially while owning guns. And then those people are to blame. But no, according to the authorities, right, everybody else is to blame for that problem instead of those people, just ridiculous and so typical, These are the police, by the way, who are expected to show up in a situation like that, protect your children. Give me a break. Apparently, they're more concerned with the shooter's preferred pronouns. Now, if the shooter had not already killed himself, genuine question in that case, right? Are the police going to show up and say, "Freeze! What are your preferred pronouns?" first before figuring out what to do? Seriously? Give me a freaking break. But anyways, that said though, guys, let me know your thoughts on this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new. And until next time, God bless and peace.